The federal courthouse loomed like a concrete monument to justice, its imposing columns casting long shadows across the steps where Marco Santangelo emerged from the black SUV. The handcuffs felt heavier than they should have, but his confidence remained unshaken. After all, when you could afford the best legal team money could buy, federal racketeering charges were just another business expense. Have you ever had your past catch up to you in the worst possible moment? Sometimes fate has a twisted sense of timing, and for Marco, walking up those courthouse steps would prove that some encounters can change everything. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story of justice, love, and second chances is about to begin. His three-piece Armani suit had been tailored specifically for court appearances, projecting the image of a successful businessman rather than the head of one of New York's most powerful crime families. The media buzzed around the perimeter like vultures, their cameras clicking frantically as he maintained his practiced expression of calm indifference. This was theater, nothing more. The charges would be dismissed, the witnesses would recant or disappear, and he would walk free. It was how these things always went for the Santangelos. The courthouse interior was all polished marble and echoing footsteps, a temple to a system Marco had learned to navigate through expensive lawyers and strategic donations. His attorney, the legendary criminal defense expert Patricia Coleman, walked beside him with her own brand of predatory confidence. She had never lost a case involving organized crime, and Marco's situation would not be her first failure. As they approached courtroom foray, Marco's thoughts drifted to the evidence the prosecution claimed to have. Wiretaps, financial records, witness testimony. All of it circumstantial, all of it deniable. The Santangelo family had survived federal investigations for 3 generations by staying one step ahead of law enforcement. This trial would be no different. But as the heavy courtroom doors swung open, something shifted in Marco's chest. The familiar confidence wavered, replaced by a sensation he had not experienced in years. Fear. Not the adrenaline-fueled fear of violence or business deals gone wrong, but something deeper, more personal. The fear of a man about to face his greatest mistake. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, and curious spectators drawn by the promise of seeing a real-life mafia don on trial. Marco took his seat at the defense table, his dark green eyes scanning the room with practiced awareness. Everything seemed normal, everything seemed under control, until the bailiff spoke those fateful words. All rise for the Honorable Judge Zara Williams. The name hit him like a physical blow. It could not be her. Not here, not now, not presiding over the case that could determine his freedom. But as the figure in black robes emerged from the judge's chambers, Marco's world tilted on its axis. 5 years fell away in an instant. 5 years since he had last seen those warm brown eyes, that intelligent face, that regal bearing that had first captured his attention in constitutional law class at Columbia. Zara Williams, the brilliant law student who had believed in justice with the fervor of a true believer. Zara Williams, who had looked at him like he could be more than his family name. Zara Williams, whose heart he had broken when she discovered the truth about the Santangelo empire. She was older now, more confident, wearing authority like a perfectly fitted gown. Her natural hair was styled in a professional twist that showcased the elegant line of her neck, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years spent in courtrooms fighting for the law she had always revered. But Marco knew her tells. The slight tension in her shoulders when she was struggling to maintain composure. The way her fingers found her pen when she was thinking. The careful control of her expression when she was fighting not to reveal her emotions. She knew he was there. She had to know. But as she settled into her chair and called the court to session, she did not look at him directly. Professional to the core, even now. The prosecution's opening statement washed over Marco like background noise. Words about racketeering, money laundering, intimidation, and violence. All things that were probably true, but impossible to prove beyond reasonable doubt. His attention remained fixed on the woman behind the bench, remembering late nights in the law library when she would argue passionately about the importance of judicial integrity, the sacred trust between the courts and the people. How different things might have been if he had told her the truth from the beginning. If he had trusted her with the reality of his family's business, instead of constructing elaborate lies about import-export companies and real estate investments. But at 24, With his father recently dead and the weight of an empire on his shoulders, Marco had been terrified that the truth would drive away the one person who saw him as something other than a criminal legacy. She had found out anyway, of course. A brilliant law student does not remain oblivious to the boyfriend whose family owns half the restaurants in Little Italy and whose uncle has been indicted twice for racketeering. When she confronted him, demanding honesty, Marco had chosen pride over love. He had let her walk away rather than expose the vulnerabilities that truth would have required. Now here they were, on opposite sides of a courtroom, with her holding his freedom in her hands. As Patricia began her opening statement, Marco allowed himself to truly study Zara's face. The years had been kind to her, adding depth to her beauty and strength to her bearing. She was successful, that much was obvious. Federal judges were not appointed lightly, especially young black women in a system still dominated by old white men. She had fought for this position, had probably faced challenges and obstacles that his privileged background could never fully comprehend. A movement in the gallery caught his attention, drawing his focus away from the bench. An elderly black woman sat in the third row, her silver hair neatly styled, her church dress pressed and dignified. She held the hand of a small boy, perhaps 4 years old, who was clearly struggling to sit still during the formal proceedings. The child was beautiful, with caramel skin and an unruly mop of dark curls. But it was his eyes that made Marco's breath catch in his throat. Green eyes. Not just any green, but the distinctive emerald shade that marked every male in the Santangelo bloodline. The same eyes that stared back at him from mirrors and family photographs. The same eyes that his father and grandfather and great-grandfather had carried. The boy turned in his seat, looking around the courtroom with the curious intelligence of a child who understood he was somewhere important but did not quite know why. When his gaze landed on Marco, there was a moment of recognition, the way children sometimes stare at adults who remind them of someone familiar. Marco's heart hammered against his ribs as he studied the child's features more carefully. The olive complexion that could pass for Italian. The strong jawline that was already evident despite his youth. The way he held his head with unconscious confidence. And most damning of all, the small birthmark below his left ear, shaped like a crescent moon. The same birthmark Marco had inherited from his father. The same birthmark that appeared on Santangelo men across generations. Mathematics was simple. 4 years old. 5 years since he and Zara had ended their relationship. The timing was perfect, terrible, inevitable. He had a son. Zara had been pregnant when she left him, had carried and delivered and raised his child in secret. His child was sitting in the gallery of the courtroom where his freedom was being decided by the woman who had once loved him and whom he had never stopped loving. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical assault. How many nights had she spent alone, knowing she carried the child of a man whose world she could not accept? How many times had she looked at their son and seen Marco's face staring back at her? How had she managed law school and pregnancy and single motherhood while building the career that had brought her to this bench? Judge Williams called for a brief recess, and as the courtroom emptied, Marco remained in his seat, his mind reeling. His son, his beautiful, intelligent son, who did not know that his father was the defendant in a federal criminal trial, who probably did not know his father existed at all. The old woman in the gallery guided the boy toward the exit, but not before the child turned one more time to look at Marco with those unmistakable green eyes. The expression on his small face was curious rather than afraid, as if he sensed some connection but could not name it. As they disappeared into the hallway, Marco felt something he had not experienced since childhood. Complete helplessness. All his money, all his power, all his carefully constructed defenses meant nothing in the face of this moment. He was just a man who had lost the woman he loved and missed the first 4 years of his son's life because he had been too proud and too scared to trust her with the truth. When court reconvened, Judge Zara Williams took her seat with the same professional composure, but Marco caught the slight tremor in her hands as she organized her papers. She felt it too, this charged atmosphere of shared secrets and buried history. She knew he had seen the boy. She knew he understood. The trial would continue, the evidence would be presented, and a verdict would eventually be reached. But the real judgment had already begun. The judgment of a man forced to confront the consequences of his choices, sitting in a federal courtroom while the love of his life held his fate in her hands, and his son sat in the gallery with another man's name, unaware that his father was finally, devastatingly close enough to touch. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone who had spent years building airtight cases against organized crime families. Her testimony would be crucial for the prosecution, and Marco knew it. What he had not expected was how difficult it would be to concentrate on her words while Zara sat mere feet away, her presence affecting him more powerfully than any government witness ever could. Agent Torres began with surveillance footage from Marco's restaurant, La Famiglia, describing how federal agents had documented meetings between Marco and known associates of various crime families. The video played on screens throughout the courtroom, showing Marco in animated conversation with men whose names appeared regularly in FBI files. To any reasonable observer, it looked damning. But Marco found himself watching Zara instead of the evidence that could send him to prison. She had always possessed perfect posture, but now she carried herself with the authority that came from years of commanding courtrooms. Her judicial robes could not hide the way she had grown into her power, becoming the formidable woman he had always known she could be. The shy law student who used to bite her lip when nervous had evolved into someone who controlled every aspect of her environment with quiet confidence. She was beautiful, more beautiful than his memory had preserved. The years had refined her features, adding character to her face and depth to her eyes. When she leaned forward to review a document, Marco caught a glimpse of the delicate gold chain at her throat, and he wondered if she still had the cross pendant he had given her for their first Christmas together. The testimony continued with Agent Torres describing the sophisticated money laundering operation the FBI suspected the Santangelo family of running through legitimate businesses. Marco's attention snapped back to the proceedings when she mentioned his charitable foundation, the one he had established to fund legal aid clinics in underserved communities. The irony was almost too much to bear. He had created that foundation because of Zara, because of her passionate speeches about equal access to justice. Even after she left him, he had continued to fund it in her honor. Did she know? Had she ever wondered why the Santangelo Foundation focused specifically on legal assistance for disadvantaged families? Had she recognized his hand in the anonymous donations that had kept several legal aid societies afloat during budget cuts? Zara's expression remained carefully neutral throughout the testimony, but Marco caught the slight tightening around her eyes when Agent Torres mentioned the foundation. She knew. Of course she knew. Zara Williams had always been too intelligent to miss connections, too thorough to overlook details. A memory surfaced without warning, as vivid as if it were happening again. 5 years ago, in her small apartment near campus, surrounded by law books and takeout containers from their favorite Thai restaurant, Zara had been studying for her constitutional law final, her hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders as she bent over her notes. Marco had been watching her from the couch, marveling at her intensity, her absolute dedication to understanding every nuance of legal theory. "You know what I love about the law?" she had said, looking up at him with those warm brown eyes that had held complete trust in him. "It is supposed to be the same for everyone, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. In a courtroom, everyone is equal under the law." How naive they had both been. How painfully, beautifully naive. The Marco of 5 years ago had loved her idealism even as he knew it could never include him. The weight of his family name, the expectations of his position, the brutal realities of maintaining power in a world where violence was just another business tool. None of that fit into Zara's vision of justice and equality. So he had lied, constructing an elaborate fiction about his family's legitimate business interests, telling himself he was protecting her from a truth she could never accept. The lies had grown more complex as their relationship deepened. When she asked about his family, he spoke vaguely about real estate investments and import businesses. When she wondered why he always carried so much cash, he claimed it was a family habit from the old country. When his uncle was arrested on racketeering charges, he told her it was a case of mistaken identity, government overreach against successful Italian Americans. She had believed him because she loved him, because she wanted to believe that the man she was falling for was everything he appeared to be. Until the night she showed up at his apartment with tears streaming down her face and newspaper clippings in her hands. The memory of that confrontation still had the power to stop his breathing. The way her voice had broken when she asked him to tell her the articles were wrong, that his family was not what the FBI said they were, that everything between them had not been built on lies. The way she had looked at him when he could not deny the truth any longer. Not angry, not yet. Just devastated. Completely, utterly devastated. "I thought I knew you," she had whispered. "I thought I loved the real you." "You did," he had tried to tell her. "You do. This does not change who I am with you." But it changed everything for her. The man she had fallen for did not exist. Could not exist. In her world of absolute justice and moral clarity, there was no room for the complexities of his reality. No space for the man who could be gentle with her while ordering violence against his enemies. No understanding for the son who had inherited a legacy he never chose but could not abandon. She had walked out that night, and Marco had let her go. Pride, fear, and the certainty that her world could never include his had kept him from following. He told himself it was for the best, that she deserved better than a life shadowed by federal investigations and the constant threat of violence. Now, watching her command this courtroom with effortless authority, he realized how much he had underestimated her strength. The woman on that bench was not the idealistic law student who had needed protection from harsh realities. This was someone who had faced those realities and conquered them, who had built a career on principles without losing her ability to navigate complex moral terrain. During the lunch recess, Marco remained seated as the courtroom emptied. His legal team huddled around him, discussing strategy and witness preparation, but his focus was entirely on the elderly woman and small boy who had remained in the gallery. The woman was clearly Zara's mother, sharing the same regal bearing and intelligent eyes. The boy, his son, was restless after hours of forced stillness. "Luca," he heard the grandmother say softly. The boy's name was Luca, a good Italian name, though Marco wondered if Zara had chosen it deliberately or if it was simply coincidence. The boy had a small red car in his hands, making quiet engine noises as he drove it along the bench where they sat. When it slipped from his grip and rolled toward the aisle, Luca scrambled to retrieve it without thinking about where he was going. The federal marshals were changing shifts, moving through the courtroom with practiced efficiency, but they were not watching for a 4-year-old who had just spotted his favorite toy rolling toward danger. One of the officers, carrying a heavy equipment case, was backing through the doorway just as Luca darted into his path. Marco moved without thinking. The handcuffs that chained him to his chair brought him up short, but his voice carried across the courtroom with unmistakable authority. "Stop!" The marshal froze instantly, the case suspended inches from where Luca was reaching for his toy. In the sudden silence, Marco's protective instincts roared to life with an intensity that surprised him. This was his son, his child, and every fiber of his being demanded that he ensure the boy's safety. Luca looked up at Marco with curious eyes, unafraid, but clearly wondering why the man in the expensive suit was suddenly the center of attention. Marco's throat closed as he saw himself in the child's fearless expression, the same confidence that had gotten both of them into trouble over the years. "Thank you," the grandmother said quietly, moving to collect Luca with gentle hands. She looked at Marco with recognition and something that might have been gratitude, but also wariness. She knew who he was, knew what he represented in her daughter's life and in her grandson's future. From the judge's entrance, Marco caught sight of Zara returning from chambers. She saw him looking at Luca, saw the tableau of the boy safe in her mother's arms because of Marco's intervention. Her sharp intake of breath was audible across the courtroom, and in that sound, Marco heard confirmation of everything he had begun to suspect. This was his son. The child carried his eyes, his features, his protective instincts calling to something primal in Marco's blood. And Zara, brilliant and careful Zara, had kept this secret for 4 years, raising their son alone rather than involve him in a world she could not accept. That evening, Zara Williams sat in her comfortable Georgetown townhouse, watching Luca play with building blocks on the living room floor. The normality of the scene felt surreal after the emotional minefield of the day's proceedings. Her mother had taken Luca to the courthouse against Zara's explicit instructions, claiming the boy needed to understand why his mother was working such long hours. What her mother had really wanted, Zara suspected, was to force a confrontation that had been 5 years in the making. Luca looked up at her with those unmistakable green eyes, the same eyes that had haunted her dreams and filled her with joy every morning for 4 years. He was Marco's son in every way that mattered, from his fearless curiosity to his natural charm with strangers. Even his way of tilting his head when he was thinking was pure Santangelo. "Mama," he said, abandoning his blocks to climb into her lap with the unconscious confidence of a child who had never doubted his welcome. "The man with the pretty eyes was nice to me today." He made the scary man stop. Zara's heart clenched as she held her son close, breathing in his familiar scent of apple shampoo and childhood innocence. The man with the pretty eyes. If only Luca knew that those eyes were identical to his own, that the stranger who had protected him was the father who had never known he existed. She had spent years justifying her decision to keep Marco's paternity a secret. He was dangerous, his world was violent. Their son deserved better than a life overshadowed by federal investigations and criminal enterprises. But sitting in that courtroom today, watching Marco's face when he realized the truth, Zara had seen something that challenged every rationalization she had constructed. She had seen love. Pure, overwhelming, immediate love for a child he had just discovered existed. Whatever else Marco Santangelo might be, whatever crimes he might have committed, his reaction to learning about Luca had been that of a father, not a criminal. The protective instinct that had made him call out to save their son from harm had been genuine, powerful, undeniable. For 4 years, she had told herself she was protecting Luca from his father's world. But tonight, holding her son and remembering the wonder in Marco's eyes, she wondered if she had actually been protecting herself from the man she had never stopped loving, even when loving him seemed impossible. Tomorrow the trial would continue, and she would have to maintain her professional objectivity while sitting mere feet from the father of her child. She would have to make decisions about his freedom while knowing that her son shared his blood, his eyes, his stubborn determination to protect the people he loved. The weight of secrets had never felt heavier. The burden of choices made in pain and fear had never seemed more complex. But as Luca fell asleep in her arms, his small hand curled trustingly against her heart, Zara knew that whatever came next, whatever truth finally emerged from this impossible situation, her son's welfare would remain her highest priority. Even if that meant confronting the man who had broken her heart and admitting that some lies, however well-intentioned, could not be maintained forever. The prosecution's star witness took the stand on day 3 with the nervous energy of a man who knew his testimony would either secure his own freedom or sign his death warrant. Anthony Ricci had been Marco's accountant for 8 years before agreeing to cooperate with federal authorities, and his knowledge of the Santangelo family's financial operations was encyclopedic and damaging. But it was his testimony about rival families that made Marco's blood run cold. The Corellis have been moving aggressively to absorb Santangelo territory for the past 18 months, Ricci testified, his voice barely steady as he avoided looking in Marco's direction. They view this trial as an opportunity to eliminate their primary competition permanently. Vincent Corelli has made no secret of his intention to destroy everything the Santangelos have built, including their legitimate business interests. Marco's attorney objected to the testimony as prejudicial, but the damage was already done. The prosecution was painting a picture of a crime family under siege, desperate enough to resort to increasingly violent tactics to maintain power. What they did not understand, what they could not know, was that the Corellis did not limit their vengeance to business rivals. They went after families, women, children. As Ricci detailed the methods the Corelli organization used to pressure their enemies, Marco's attention shifted to the gallery where Zara's mother sat with Luca. The boy was drawing with crayons on a small pad of paper, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he worked on what appeared to be a picture of a car. He looked so innocent, so completely unaware of the danger that might already be circling around him. During the morning recess, Marco made a point of studying the faces in the courtroom more carefully. Most were familiar: reporters, federal agents, court personnel he recognized from previous hearings. But there were 2 men in cheap suits sitting near the back who did not belong. Their attention was focused not on the proceedings, but on the gallery where his son sat with his grandmother. Marco had survived 32 years in a dangerous world by trusting his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was now screaming warnings. The men's positioning gave them clear sightlines to Zara's family. Their body language suggested readiness to move quickly if needed. And most damning of all, one of them had the distinctive neck tattoo that marked him as Corelli Muscle. They knew. Somehow, the Corellis had discovered that Judge Zara Williams was more than just an inconvenient obstacle to their plans. They knew she had been Marco's lover, knew about the child who carried Santangelo blood, and they were already positioning themselves to use that knowledge as a weapon. When court reconvened, Marco tried to catch Zara's attention, but she remained focused on the proceedings with professional determination. She had no idea that her past relationship with him had made her a target, no understanding that the son she had fought so hard to protect from his world was already in danger because of it. The afternoon dragged on with more technical testimony about money laundering and interstate commerce violations. Marco answered his attorney's questions mechanically, his mind racing through contingency plans and protective measures. He needed to warn Zara, needed to ensure her safety and Luca's, but his options were severely limited by his current legal situation. As the court day ended and spectators began filing out, Marco watched the two Corelli soldiers leave their seats and follow Zara and her family at a discreet distance. His hands clenched into fists, the handcuffs cutting into his wrists as rage and helplessness warred in his chest. If anything happened to them because of him, because of his family's enemies seeking revenge through innocent people, he would burn the entire Corelli organization to the ground. That evening, Zara arrived home to find her quiet Georgetown street disturbed by an unusual amount of activity. Construction workers were digging up the sidewalk across from her townhouse, their equipment creating noise and chaos that seemed oddly timed for evening hours. A utility van was parked at the corner, its occupants reading newspapers rather than working. And most unsettling of all, her neighbor's dog, usually friendly and calm, was agitated and barking incessantly at shadows. Her mother had taken Luca to his swimming lesson, giving Zara a rare hour alone to decompress from the emotional strain of presiding over Marco's trial. But instead of finding peace in her home, she discovered an envelope that had been slipped under her front door while she was at work. The message inside was brief and terrifying in its simplicity. Nice boy. Pretty eyes. Would hate for something to happen to the judge and her son. Zara's hands shook as she read the words again, her legal mind immediately cataloging the implications. This was not random crime or courthouse security failure. Someone knew about her connection to Marco, knew about Luca's parentage, and was threatening them both. The only organizations with the resources and motivation to make such threats were the same criminal families she had been sentencing from her bench for the past 2 years. She thought about every case she had heard involving organized crime, every harsh sentence she had imposed, every appeal she had denied. How many enemies had she made in her pursuit of justice? How many dangerous men now viewed her as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a judge to be respected? The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had spent years trying to protect Luca from Marco's world, only to discover that her own career had made them targets anyway. Every decision she made from the bench, every ruling she issued in the name of justice, had the potential to create enemies who would not hesitate to use her son as leverage. When her phone rang, Zara nearly jumped out of her skin. The caller ID showed the federal detention center where Marco was being held, and she knew she should not answer. Judges did not take phone calls from defendants in their courtrooms. It violated every ethical principle she had sworn to uphold. But this was about Luca's safety. This was about the threat that connected them whether she acknowledged it or not. She answered on the fourth ring. Zara, Marco's voice was strained with barely controlled urgency. Listen to me very carefully. You and Luca are in danger. I cannot talk to you, she said, though she made no move to hang up. You know I cannot talk to you about the case. This is not about the case. Marco's voice dropped to the tone she remembered from their most serious conversations 5 years ago. This is about our son. The Corellis know about him, know about you. They left you a message tonight. How did you know about the message? Zara's voice was barely a whisper. Because I know how they operate. Because I have been watching for exactly this kind of retaliation since the moment I realized you were the judge assigned to my case. They will use anyone connected to me to gain leverage, and that includes you and Luca. I can handle myself, Zara said, but even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. Her judicial security was designed to protect against disgruntled defendants and courthouse disruptions, not organized crime families with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. You cannot handle the Corellis alone, Marco said flatly. No one can. You need protection, professional protection, and you need it tonight. I will not accept help from you. The words came out harder than she intended, fueled by years of carefully maintained distance and the terror of being drawn back into his world. I will not make my son a target by associating with you. He is already a target. Marco's voice broke slightly. He is my son, which makes him a target regardless of whether you accept my help. The only question now is whether you will let me protect him or whether you will let your pride put him in greater danger. Zara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Everything she had built, every carefully constructed barrier between her life and Marco's world, was crumbling because of threats she could not control and enemies she had not seen coming. I have to think about this, she said finally. You do not have time to think, Marco replied urgently. They are watching your house right now. They know your mother picked up Luca from school today. They know his swimming schedule, his daycare routine, everything that makes him vulnerable. How do you know all of this? Because my people have been watching them watch you. Because the moment I suspected you might be in danger, I made arrangements to ensure your safety whether you wanted them or not. The line went quiet for a long moment as Zara processed the implications of his words. He had been protecting them without her knowledge, maintaining surveillance on her family while respecting her desire for distance. It should have angered her, this presumption and invasion of privacy. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to relief. Tomorrow morning, Marco continued, my attorney will approach you about a matter of mutual interest and safety. Listen to what she has to say. Accept the protection she offers. And remember that whatever you think of me, whatever mistakes I have made, I will never let anyone hurt our son. Before Zara could respond, the line went dead, leaving her alone in her kitchen with a threatening note and the certain knowledge that her carefully ordered world was about to change forever. An hour later, as she tucked Luca into bed, her son looked up at her with those unmistakable green eyes and asked the question that nearly broke her heart. Mama, will I see the nice man with my eyes again tomorrow? Zara smoothed his dark curls away from his forehead, her throat tight with unshed tears. I do not know, baby. I do not know what tomorrow will bring. As Luca drifted off to sleep, Zara stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the street that no longer felt safe. Somewhere in the shadows, she knew, dangerous men were planning ways to use her son against his father. And somewhere else in those same shadows, Marco's people were watching, waiting, ready to protect the child whose existence had changed everything. The weight of truth had never felt heavier. The cost of secrets had never been more clear. And for the first time in 5 years, Zara Williams found herself grateful for the protection of a man whose world she had once believed she could never accept. The playground at Luca's preschool was chaos in the best possible way, filled with the joyful noise of children who had been trapped indoors all morning and were finally free to run and climb and shout. Zara's mother, Eleanor Williams, sat on a bench near the jungle gym, keeping one eye on her grandson and another on the other parents who were scattered around the fenced area. She had noticed the 2 men in the black sedan parked across the street when she arrived to pick up Luca, but Georgetown was full of government workers and expensive cars, so their presence had not immediately alarmed her. It was only when they remained in the vehicle for 20 minutes without moving, their attention focused on the playground rather than their phones or each other, that her instincts began to whisper warnings. Eleanor Williams had raised a daughter who became a federal judge by teaching her to be observant, cautious, and prepared for the unexpected. She had also spent the past 4 years helping to raise a grandson whose parentage connected him to a world she hoped he would never have to understand. But hope and reality were different things, and reality was currently sitting in a black sedan watching her grandson play. Luca was on the swing set, pumping his legs with determined concentration as he tried to swing higher than his friend Marcus. His laughter carried across the playground, pure and innocent, and completely unaware that he had inherited more than just his father's eyes. He had inherited his enemies as well. When the 2 men finally emerged from their vehicle, Eleanor's protective instincts shifted into high alert. They moved with the casual confidence of people who were used to intimidating others, their attention fixed on the playground with unmistakable intent. One of them spoke into a phone while the other began walking toward the school's entrance. The attack, when it came, was swift and almost successful. The first man approached the playground equipment where Luca was playing, pulling out a badge that looked official enough to fool most observers. "School security," he announced to the teacher on duty. "We need to speak with Luca Williams about a family emergency." But Eleanor had been watching, had seen the coordination between the two men, had noticed that their supposed emergency coincided perfectly with the end of the school day when the playground would be most crowded and chaotic. She moved quickly, crossing the distance between the bench and the swing set with the speed of a grandmother whose protective instincts had been activated. "Luca, honey, come here right now," she called, her voice carrying the authority that had made her daughter into a judge and her grandson into an obedient child. "We need to go home." The man with the badge smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Ma'am, I just need to speak with the boy for a moment. There has been an incident involving his mother." Eleanor stepped between the stranger and her grandson, every alarm bell in her head ringing at maximum volume. "I am his grandmother, and I will need to see proper identification before you speak with him about anything." That was when the second man appeared, moving to block the playground's exit while his partner reached for Luca with hands that were decidedly not gentle. The boy, confused by the sudden tension among the adults, looked around for familiar faces and began to cry. The sound of his grandson's distress triggered something primal in Eleanor, but before she could react, a new voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Step away from the child. Now." Viktor Petrov materialized between the would-be kidnappers and his targets with the silent efficiency that had made him Marco's most trusted lieutenant for the past 8 years. He was not a large man, but there was something in his stillness that suggested violence barely held in check, and the two Corelli soldiers recognized a predator when they saw one. "This is school business," the first man said, but his confidence was wavering as he reassessed the situation. "We are handling a family emergency." Victor's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I know exactly what kind of emergency you are handling. The question is whether you want to walk away from this playground under your own power or whether you prefer to be carried away by paramedics." The standoff lasted only seconds, but Eleanor used them to scoop Luca into her arms and move toward Victor's position. She did not know who this man was, did not understand why he was there or how he had arrived at the perfect moment, but she recognized protection when she saw it. The Corelli soldiers were professionals, but they were also pragmatists. A kidnapping attempt in broad daylight at a school playground was high risk under the best circumstances. A kidnapping attempt that had been anticipated and blocked by someone who clearly knew their game was suicide. They retreated to their vehicle without another word, but not before making it clear that this was a temporary setback rather than a permanent defeat. Victor waited until the black sedan had disappeared around the corner before turning his attention to Eleanor and Luca. The boy had stopped crying but was clinging to his grandmother with the desperate grip of a child who sensed that something terrible had almost happened. "Mrs. Williams," Victor said, his accent carrying traces of an Eastern European childhood that he had never quite lost. "My name is Viktor Petrov. I work for Marco Santangelo, and I am here to ensure your safety and the safety of your grandson." Eleanor studied his face, seeing sincerity beneath the controlled violence. "I know who you work for," she said quietly. "The question is what happens now." "Now we go somewhere safe," Victor replied. "Somewhere my people can protect you properly while we deal with the threat permanently." The safe house was a nondescript townhouse in Alexandria, furnished with expensive but impersonal furniture that suggested it was maintained for emergencies rather than comfort. Eleanor settled Luca in the living room with cartoons and snacks, while Victor made phone calls that were brief and conducted in a language she did not recognize. It was there, 3 hours later, that Marco Santangelo arrived with the electronic monitoring device still attached to his ankle and a federal marshal's warrant for his arrest in his wake. He had violated his house arrest to reach them, had risked additional charges and almost certain imprisonment to ensure their safety. When he walked through the door and saw Luca safe in Eleanor's arms, the relief on his face was so profound that it transformed his features from hardened criminal to vulnerable father. Zara arrived 20 minutes later, having left her courtroom the moment Victor's people contacted her office about the attempted kidnapping. She burst through the safe house door with her judicial composure completely abandoned, her terror and fury written across every line of her body. The confrontation that followed was 5 years in the making. Where the hell do you get off making decisions about my son without consulting me? Zara's voice shook with rage and fear as she faced Marco in the safe house kitchen. You had no right to put people on surveillance. No right to make protection arrangements. No right to involve him in your world. My world? Marco's control finally snapped, for years of suppressed pain and anger exploding to the surface. He is already in my world, Zara. He has been in my world since the moment you decided to keep his existence a secret from me. You think keeping me away from him kept him safe? You think pretending he was not a Santangelo meant he could never be targeted by Santangelo enemies? I was protecting him from exactly this, Zara shot back. From kidnapping attempts and safe houses and men with guns watching his playground. I was protecting him from a life where his safety depends on how many people his father has killed. The words hung in the air between them like physical blows, and Marco felt something inside him break at her casual condemnation of everything he was. But beneath the pain was a fury that matched her own, born of 4 years of missing his son's life because she had made a unilateral decision about what was best for all of them. You were protecting yourself, Marco said quietly, his voice deadly calm. You were protecting yourself from having to make hard choices about love and loyalty and what you could accept. So you ran, and you took my son with you, and you convinced yourself it was noble instead of cowardly. Zara recoiled as if he had struck her. How dare you call me a coward? How dare you judge my choices when you are the one who lied about everything, who built our entire relationship on deception? I lied about my family's business, Marco replied. I never lied about loving you. I never lied about wanting a future with you. I never lied about who I was when I was with you. The fight went out of Zara suddenly, leaving her swaying on her feet as exhaustion and fear caught up with her. She sank into a kitchen chair, her face in her hands, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after I left you, she said. 3 weeks after I discovered that the man I loved was everything I had been taught to oppose. I was 26 years old, finishing law school, and carrying the child of someone I could never trust again. Marco felt his heart stop as the implications of her words sank in. 3 weeks. She had been pregnant when she left him, had faced that revelation alone while still reeling from the discovery of his lies. I sat in that doctor's office, Zara continued, tears streaming down her face, and I had to decide whether to tell you, whether to give you the chance to be a father or whether to protect our child from the violence and chaos of your world. I chose protection. I chose to raise him alone rather than expose him to federal investigations and rival families and the constant fear that someone would hurt him to hurt you. And how did that work out? Marco asked gently, kneeling beside her chair. How did keeping me away from him keep him safe from the very thing that almost happened today? Zara looked at him through her tears, seeing not the dangerous criminal she had been fighting in her mind for 5 years, but the man who had broken federal detention protocols to ensure their son's safety. The man whose people had been watching over Luca without her knowledge, protecting him from threats she had not even known existed. In the living room, Luca had fallen asleep on Eleanor's lap, exhausted by the day's excitement and unaware that his parents were finally confronting the truths they had avoided for 5 years. Marco moved to the doorway, studying the face of the son he was only just beginning to know. The resemblance was unmistakable now that he knew to look for it. Not just the eyes and the coloring, but the stubborn set of his jaw, even in sleep, the way his hands curled into fists like he was ready to fight the world. He was beautiful, this child they had created together, and Marco felt a love so overwhelming it threatened to bring him to his knees. He looks like you when you sleep, Zara said softly, joining him in the doorway. Even as a baby, he would scrunch up his face like he was solving problems in his dreams. Marco turned to find her watching him with an expression he had not seen in 5 years. Not the careful professional mask she wore in the courtroom, not the angry hurt that had filled her voice during their fight, but the soft vulnerability that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. I missed so much, he said, his voice broken. His first words, his first steps, teaching him to tie his shoes. For years of bedtime stories and scraped knees and everything that makes a childhood. Zara reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his for the first time since they had been lovers instead of adversaries. "I was scared," she whispered. "I was so scared of what loving you meant, of what it would cost him to be your son." The kiss that followed was inevitable. 5 years of suppressed longing and unresolved love finally given permission to surface. It was desperate and tender and filled with the recognition that some connections were too powerful to be severed by fear or time or the complicated realities of their different worlds. When they finally broke apart, breathless and clinging to each other in the doorway of the safe house, Marco rested his forehead against hers and spoke the truth that had been burning in his chest since the moment he saw their son. "I love you," he said simply. "I never stopped loving you, and I never will. But more than that, I love him, and I will spend the rest of my life making up for the years I lost, protecting him from everything that threatens him, including the parts of my world that are too dangerous for children." Tomorrow there would be consequences. Additional charges for violating house arrest, professional complications for Zara, decisions about custody and protection and how to build a future that included all of them. But tonight, in a safe house surrounded by the reality of threats they could no longer ignore, Marco and Zara held each other and their sleeping son and admitted that some love was worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Marco's return to federal custody came with the kind of media circus that prosecutors dream about and defense attorneys have nightmares over. The fact that he had violated his house arrest to protect his secret family created headlines that painted him as either a devoted father or a calculating criminal who would exploit even his own child for sympathy. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. The additional charges were read in a packed courtroom where every seat was filled with reporters, federal agents, and curious spectators drawn by the soap opera elements of a mafia boss, a federal judge, and their secret child. Marco stood before the bench in shackles, his expensive suit wrinkled from a night in federal lockup, facing the reality that his decision to protect Luca might have cost him any chance of freedom. But when he looked into the gallery and saw his son safe in Eleanor's arms, Marco felt no regret. Some choices transcended legal consequences. Some responsibilities mattered more than personal freedom. Judge Harrison took the bench with the weary expression of a man who had presided over enough high-profile cases to recognize a potential disaster when he saw one. The prosecution's motion for revocation of bail was inevitable, their argument straightforward. Marco Santangelo had proven he could not be trusted to follow court orders, and his continued detention was necessary to ensure public safety. The defense's response was more nuanced. Patricia Coleman argued that her client's actions were those of a father protecting his child from credible threats, that his immediate surrender after ensuring his family's safety demonstrated respect for the legal process rather than contempt for it. She painted a picture of a man torn between legal obligations and parental responsibilities, who had chosen his son's welfare over his own freedom. It was during this hearing that Zara Williams made the decision that would define the rest of the proceedings. "Your Honor," she said, rising from her seat in the gallery where she had been watching the contempt hearing rather than presiding over it. "I need to address the court about a conflict of interest that requires my immediate recusal from this case." Judge Harrison looked surprised, but gestured for her to approach the bench. The conversation that followed was conducted in whispers that the court reporter captured but the gallery could not hear. When Zara returned to her seat, her face was pale but resolute. "Due to circumstances that have come to light during these proceedings," Harrison announced, "Judge Williams has recused herself from this case, citing personal conflicts that would compromise her ability to remain impartial. This court will be adjourned pending the assignment of a new judge to handle the remainder of the trial." The media explosion that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, speculation about the nature of Zara's conflict filled every news cycle and legal blog in the country. The most persistent rumors centered on her relationship with the defendant, though the details remained frustratingly vague for journalists trying to construct a complete narrative. Marco was returned to his cell to await the new judge's assignment, but not before sharing a long look with Zara across the courtroom. In that moment of eye contact, he saw her acknowledgement that their private world had officially collided with their public responsibilities, that there was no going back to the careful distance she had maintained for 5 years. The new judge assigned to the case was the Honorable Margaret Chun, a no-nonsense jurist known for running efficient courtrooms and having little patience for dramatic antics from either prosecutors or defense attorneys. She reviewed the case files over the weekend and resumed proceedings the following Tuesday with the clear intention of bringing the trial to a swift conclusion. It was during Chin's first day presiding that the case took an unexpected turn. The prosecution had rested their case, confident that their evidence of racketeering and money laundering was sufficient for conviction. The defense had presented their standard arguments about circumstantial evidence and reasonable doubt. But it was Patricia Coleman's surprise witness who changed the entire trajectory of the trial. Margaret Santos had been the Santangelo family's accountant before Anthony Ricci, handling their finances during the critical transition period when Marco first assumed leadership after his father's death. Unlike Ricci, she had not been offered immunity in exchange for cooperation. She testified voluntarily, arriving at the courthouse with boxes of records that told a story neither the prosecution nor the defense had anticipated. Mr. Santangelo inherited a criminal enterprise, Santos testified, her voice clear and professional as she detailed financial records dating back 6 years. But from his first day as head of the family, he began systematically transitioning their operations away from illegal activities toward legitimate business interests. The records she presented painted a picture of a man trying to honor his family's legacy while breaking free from its criminal foundations. Restaurants that had once been fronts for money laundering were converted into genuinely profitable establishments. Protection rackets were dissolved and replaced with legitimate security companies. Drug money was divested and reinvested in real estate developments that created jobs and revitalized neighborhoods. Most significantly, Santos revealed that Marco had been secretly cooperating with federal authorities for the past 2 years, providing information about other criminal organizations while working to legitimize his own family's empire. The cooperation agreement had been classified to protect his safety, but the witness intimidation and threat to his family had forced him to allow its disclosure. The prosecutor's objections filled the courtroom as their carefully constructed case crumbled under the weight of evidence that the defendant they had portrayed as a dangerous criminal was actually a government asset working to dismantle organized crime from within. Judge Chin called for a recess to review the classified documents, and during that break, Marco found himself face-to-face with Zara in the courthouse hallway. She had been sitting in the gallery throughout Santos's testimony, her expression unreadable as she learned that the man she had condemned as irredeemably criminal had been working to redeem himself long before she walked back into his life. "You knew," she said quietly. "When I left you 5 years ago, you were already planning to change everything." Marco nodded, his throat tight with the memory of those dark days after she left him. "You were right about a lot of things. About the kind of man I wanted to be, the kind of father I wanted to be if I ever had the chance. I just could not figure out how to become that man while carrying the weight of what my family had built. Why did you not tell me?" The pain in her voice was fresh, immediate. "If I had known you were trying to change, trying to build something legitimate." "Because trying and succeeding are different things," Marco replied. "Because I needed to prove to myself that I could actually do it before I had the right to ask you to believe in me again. And because by the time I had made real progress, you were gone and I had no right to disrupt the life you had built." The conversation was interrupted by Luca's voice calling out from down the hallway where Eleanor was trying to keep him entertained during the long court day. "Papa," he called, the word carrying clearly through the corridor. "Papa, come see my drawing." Marco froze at the sound of that word, the first time his son had called him father, and when he looked at Zara, he saw tears streaming down her face. "He knows," she whispered. "Somehow he knows who you are." "Children always know," Eleanor said, approaching with Luca's hand in hers. "They know love when they see it, even when the adults are too scared to admit it." When court reconvened for the defense's closing arguments, Patricia Coleman delivered a summation that focused not on reasonable doubt, but on reasonable redemption. She argued that Marco Santangelo represented the possibility of change, the hope that even men born into criminal legacies could choose different paths for themselves and their families. But it was Zara's appearance as a character witness that provided the most dramatic moment of the entire trial. Despite the professional risk, despite the potential damage to her judicial career, she took the stand to testify about the man she had known 5 years ago and the father she had watched emerge over the past week. Her testimony was careful, measured, and devastating in its sincerity. Marco Santangelo is not the same man who was indicted on these charges, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what her words would cost her. He is someone who has worked to transform not just his own life, but the lives of everyone connected to his family's legacy. He is someone who risked his freedom to protect a child he had only just discovered existed. He is someone worthy of the second chance that our legal system is supposed to provide. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on lesser charges of financial irregularities and failure to properly report business activities. Not guilty on the major racketeering and organized crime charges. The sentence reflected the complexity of the case. Time served plus 5 years of community service and supervised probation. As Marco stood to hear his fate, he felt Zara's eyes on him from the gallery. When Judge Chin announced that he would be released immediately pending his probation arrangements, the relief in the courtroom was palpable. But it was Luca's reaction that mattered most. The 4-year-old broke free from his grandmother's grip and ran down the aisle toward his father, his small voice carrying above the courtroom chatter. "Papa, are you coming home with us now?" Marco knelt to catch his son in his arms, holding him close as the weight of 5 years of separation and loss finally began to lift. Over Luca's head, he met Zara's eyes and saw in them the answer to his son's question. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I am coming home." 6 months after his release, Marco Santangelo could be found most weekday afternoons at the East Side Community Youth Center, teaching business skills to teenagers who reminded him of his younger self. Angry kids from broken neighborhoods who had learned to equate power with violence, who saw crime as their only path to respect and financial security. It was honest work, part of his court-ordered community service, but it had become something more meaningful than legal obligation. These kids needed to see that change was possible, that men could remake themselves regardless of their origins. They needed to believe that legitimate success was within their reach if they were willing to work for it. Zara often stopped by after her own court day ended, bringing Luca to play basketball in the center's gymnasium while she graded court briefs in the observation area. Watching Marco with the teenagers, seeing how naturally he connected with kids who had every reason to distrust authority figures, she understood why his transformation had been successful where others had failed. He spoke their language because he had lived their reality. The past months had not been without challenges. Marco's probation officer was thorough and demanding, requiring detailed accounting of every business meeting and financial transaction. The media attention around their relationship had forced Zara to request reassignment to appellate court work, removing herself from the criminal dockets where their personal history might create conflicts. And there had been the careful process of integrating Luca into his father's extended family, introducing him to aunts and uncles who had to learn that the Santangelo legacy now included a 4-year-old who asked questions about everything. But the difficulties had been overshadowed by the simple joy of being together as a family. Morning breakfasts where Luca insisted on sitting between his parents. Evening bedtime stories where Marco's dramatic reading style made even simple picture books into epic adventures. Weekend trips to museums and parks where they could pretend to be just another normal family enjoying their time together. Marco's transformation of the family businesses had accelerated after his release. The Santangelo Security Company now employed over 200 people in legitimate protective services for corporate clients and high-profile individuals. The restaurant empire had expanded into catering and event planning, creating jobs throughout the community. Most importantly, the charitable foundation had tripled in size, funding legal aid clinics, youth programs, and small business loans in underserved neighborhoods. It was at the youth center, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when the autumn light streamed through the gymnasium windows, that Marco asked Zara to marry him. Luca was playing pickup basketball with some of the older kids, his small frame dwarfed by teenagers who treated him like a beloved mascot. Marco and Zara sat in the bleachers, sharing a bag of popcorn from the center snack bar and talking about mundane things like parent-teacher conferences and grocery shopping. "Do you remember what you said to me in constitutional law about justice and equality?" Marco asked suddenly, his voice carrying an unusual note of nervousness. Zara looked at him curiously. "I said a lot of things in constitutional law." You will have to be more specific. You said that in a perfect courtroom, everyone would be equal under the law. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless. Everyone would have the same chance at justice. I remember that conversation, Zara replied. I also remember that you argued with me about it, said the system would never really be fair because people bring their histories and prejudices with them into every interaction. I was wrong, Marco said, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a small velvet box. Not about the system being imperfect, but about the possibility of real equality. Because sitting here with you, watching our son play with kids from every background imaginable, I realize that love is the one place where none of that other stuff matters. Love does not care about your family name or your bank account or your past mistakes. Love just cares about the choice you make every day to show up for the people who matter most. The ring was perfect, a classic solitaire that honored tradition while reflecting Zara's elegant taste. But more than the jewelry was the promise in Marco's eyes, the quiet confidence of a man who had rebuilt himself from the ground up and was ready to offer her everything he had become. Zara Williams, Marco said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that second chances can lead to forever love? Before she could answer, Luca appeared at their feet, having abandoned his basketball game when he noticed the serious conversation happening in the bleachers. What are you doing, Papa? He asked with the directness of a child who had no patience for adult mysteries. I am asking your mother to marry me, Marco said, lifting his son onto his lap so they could have this conversation as a family. What do you think about that? Luca considered the question with the gravity it deserved, his green eyes moving between his parents before settling on the ring box in Marco's hand. Will we all live together forever? He asked. That is the plan, Marco confirmed. And will you teach me to drive the big car like Uncle Victor has? When you are much, much older, Zara interjected, laughing despite the tears streaming down her face. And the answer is yes, by the way. Yes to all of it. The kiss that sealed their engagement was witnessed by a gymnasium full of teenagers who cheered with the enthusiasm of kids who believed in happy endings because they had seen one unfold in front of them. Luca clapped his hands in delight, not fully understanding the adult implications, but recognizing that his parents were happy and that their happiness meant security for him. 2 weeks later, Zara discovered she was pregnant with their second child, a revelation that sent Marco into a protective frenzy that was both endearing and exhausting. Eleanor Williams, who had initially been skeptical of her daughter's reunion with a man from such a dangerous world, found herself charmed by his obvious devotion to both Zara and Luca. Marco's mother, Isabella Santangelo, embraced her new daughter-in-law with the fierce love of a woman who had watched her son transform into someone worthy of the family name. The wedding took place on a Saturday in December at the small church where Zara had been baptized as a child. It was an intimate ceremony attended by family and close friends, including several of the teenagers from the youth center who served as unofficial security and witnesses to the union of their mentor and the judge who had believed in second chances. Luca served as ring bearer with the serious concentration of a child who understood the importance of his role. He walked down the aisle with careful steps, carrying the rings on a silk pillow and beaming with pride when he successfully delivered them without dropping anything. When Marco and Zara exchanged vows, their words carried the weight of everything they had overcome to reach this moment. They promised to love each other through legal challenges and family complications, through the demands of public careers and private responsibilities. Most importantly, they promised their children a future built on honesty, respect, and the kind of love that transforms people from who they were into who they were meant to become. The reception was held at La Famiglia, the restaurant where Marco had first learned to cook alongside his grandmother. The same dining room that had once hosted meetings between criminal associates now celebrated the marriage of a reformed crime boss and a federal judge, proving that redemption was possible even in places where hope seemed lost. As they danced to music played by a string quartet that included one of Eleanor's former students, Marco whispered promises in Zara's ear that had nothing to do with legal contracts and everything to do with the family they were building together. I promise our children will never know the fear you felt when you thought loving me meant accepting violence, he said, holding her close as they swayed to music that celebrated new beginnings. I promise they will grow up in a world where their father's reputation is built on the good he has done, not the mistakes he inherited. 6 months pregnant with their daughter and glowing with contentment, Zara looked up at her husband and saw the future she had once thought impossible. A future where love conquered fear, where second chances led to lasting happiness, where a reformed mafia boss and a principled judge could raise their children in safety and peace. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Luca fell asleep in his father's arms, exhausted by the excitement of seeing his parents married. Marco carried him to the car where Victor waited to drive the new family home, his loyalty to the Santangelo name now extending to protecting the next generation of children who would grow up knowing that their legacy was built on love rather than fear. What did you think of Marco and Zara's journey from courtroom adversaries to family? Sometimes love requires us to see beyond the surface, to believe in the possibility of change and redemption. Their story proves that even the most complicated pasts can lead to beautiful futures when people are willing to fight for each other. Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love overcoming the past, because everyone deserves a second chance at happiness. That night, in their Georgetown home that had once been Zara's sanctuary for Marco's world and was now their shared foundation for building something new, they tucked Luca into his bed and stood together in the doorway watching their son sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities as parents and partners building a life that honored both of their values. But tonight was perfect, complete, everything they had dreamed of during the long years when love seemed impossible. Marco's hand found Zara's growing belly, feeling the flutter of movement from the daughter who would grow up knowing only the reformed version of her father. This child would never question whether she was safe, never doubt that she was wanted, never wonder whether her parents' love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. "Welcome to the family, little one," he whispered, and Zara knew that their story of redemption, love, and second chances was just beginning.